we'll get going now, Ben.
Great.
So welcome, Ben, and welcome everyone else. This is our last Zoom meeting for a while. The next ones are going to be in the church. But here we have the advantage, particularly for Ben, who lives in South London, to avoid a 2-hour trip here, there and back. Anyway, we've got to know Ben pretty well over the last 18 months or so in his fantastic model, which I hope most of you, if not all of you, have taken the opportunity of seeing at the museum since it was installed during the early part of last year. And we, of course, now have reopened, and we're already getting pictures. The mayor was photographed with it at the weekend and is appearing on our local Facebook site with lots of plaudits. So
on the front page of the Herald, Steve, today.
Oh, is it? Is that what
Yeah.
it was? Okay.
Yeah.
Well, it's been picked up around about, so it's all looking pretty good. So Ben, I'll just ask people perhaps if they could make sure they're muted, and if for some reason, Ben, I have to mute all, I'll try and unmute you.
Okay.
And also for people to just to improve their viewing, sometimes it's better to turn off your video as well. I shall be doing that in a second. So over to you, Ben. And oh, sorry, just before you get going with questions, if we could leave it to the end, or if you want to, you can put them up as they occur on the chat line, and then Ben will pick them up at the end as a line of and answer those at the end. So we'll sort that out at the end, Ben, rather than it doesn't work interrupting halfway through.
Great. Okay.
Over to you.
Well, thank you very much for having me do this talk. I've been looking forward to this for a few weeks now, and I've been putting a lot of thought into how I was going to structure this talk to try and explain some of the mechanics behind making the model of Wallingford Castle. But I'd really like to start, because I feel a bit daunted talking to the Historical and Archaeological Society about Wallingford, because I expect you, of all people, are going to be the people who know it best. So I think, to begin with, I'd like to take you on a little detour and not talk about the castle, but talk about a certain gentleman who there we go, this chap. Now, this is my ancestor, my great-great-great-grandfather, William Syborn. And the reason I want to talk to you about him is because he has become a huge influence in my life. And I think that it's due to him that I am actually a model maker, and I do have the career that I pursued. He was a career soldier, and he was born slightly too early to join the Battle of Waterloo, which is something that was one of his greatest regrets in life. And after graduating from Sandhurst and being one of the first generation of gentlemen cadets, where he studied drawing, mathematics, obviously battlecraft, he was posted to Dublin. And during his time in Dublin, for some reason which we as a family have not yet got to the bottom of, he was asked by Lord Hill to produce a model of the Battle of Waterloo. Now, this was about 1830, and as I said, that he was slightly too young to have been part of the battle. He was still a cadet at the time that the battle was fought, but it obviously was an area of history, recent history for him, that he found absolutely fascinating. The problem with Captain Syborn is that he was just too efficient and far too zealous for his own good, as I will explain. This is one of his surveying instruments that he took with him to the Waterloo battlefield in 1830, where he spent 4 months surveying the battlefield from top to bottom. And from his survey, he produced this amazing map. Now, this was one of the first maps of its type in the 19th century, because it has this amazing contours, which are all done in shading. And at the top of the slide, I don't know if you can quite see, it says, place this towards the light, so that what people should do is put this on a desk by a window, and it almost becomes three-dimensional. He was so zealous about making the detail absolutely accurate. Obviously, he's putting troop movements here, and you can see the farmhouse, the famous farmhouse at La Haison is there, and all of the various battalions are marked up. And this is just a sort of a snapshot of one moment in the battle. Sorry, I'm having trouble moving slides. Right. So Captain Cyborn not only produced maps, but he also produced very, very detailed illustrations of all the soldiers and their uniforms and their brigades. And we as a family still have an amazing box of treasures, which include many, many drawings like this, which were done in so much detail. When you consider that he was making a map of a model of the entire battlefield, so the scale is very, very tiny. He put an immense amount of detail into producing literally the braid on the coats of the model figures. This is one of the model figures. They were cast in lead, and they were cast in Germany. We've tried for a very long time to track down who the actual maker was of the figures. Captain Cyborn was responsible for making the terrain, which he made out of plaster, but the figures were all made in lead, and we know they were manufactured somewhere, but we've never got to the bottom of where. Each figure had a little backpack and opposable arms so that they could actually be positioned. And it's just quite incredible, the length of detail that he went to. The model was viewed by the public, and it was meant to be this most amazing financial success for Cyborn. But there was a major problem, which was that when the Duke of Wellington heard about what he was doing, he absolutely slated the whole project. And the problem was that Captain Cyborn had done something quite extraordinary for his time. Instead of basing his research of the battlefield on the Duke of Wellington's own personal account, the famous Waterloo Dispatch, Captain Cyborn decided to interview as many troops as he could who were actually on the battlefield, discover where they were, and pinpoint their whereabouts and actually place them in miniature on his model. And the problem was that not only did Captain Cyborn interview the British, but he also interviewed the French and the Prussians. And at that point, the Duke of Wellington considered that his layout and his version of events didn't marry up with the Duke's version of events. And the sad result of that was that Captain Cyborn's model was parked by the official government of the time. Then fate intervened quite badly, and not only was the Duke of Wellington's government against the model, but the Duke of Wellington lost his seat as Prime Minister. And the next Prime Minister, now, sorry, can't remember who he was, but the next Prime Minister came in and refused to fund the model as well. So poor old Captain Cyborn had to continue without funding. He spent something like £3,000 to £4,000 on building the model, and his captain's pay brought him £300 a year. So sadly, he became much poorer for the venture, and he never was promoted again, and he never rose above the rank of captain. And for a career soldier and a graduate of Sandhurst, that was a very sad state of affairs. Now, his sort of sad career has always been a family fable in my household. Being my great-great-great-grandfather, everybody used to talk about him, and we used to go through boxes of his memorabilia, which we still have. And I think that this had a tremendous influence on me as a child. And I think it's probably one of the main reasons why I've ended up becoming a historic model maker. Now, as a model maker, I think it's very difficult to explain to people who are not sort of well initiated quite what it means to be the sort of model maker that I am, because often when you think about model makers, people think about people who build dolls' houses or people who build sort of airfix kits. And I don't really fall into either of those categories. I've specialized in creating historically accurate models, and I specialize in listed buildings and period properties. And really, so I've carved out a very, very narrow field for myself in this very wide pantheon of the model making fraternity, if you like. So to move on to work that I've produced, having talked about William Seiborn for a bit, this is a model of Auschwitz concentration camp, which I created in the year 2000, and this was under the guidance of an amazing designer and sculptor whose name is Jerry Judah. When I left college, I went to St. Martin's School of Art, and when I left college, the first thing that happened to me was that I got a job with Jerry, and I worked with him for a couple of years as his personal assistant. And he really taught me the tricks of the trade of model making. He was a sculptor, and he also worked in film and TV and production design. And together we did work for Channel 4, we did work for advertisements, pop videos, all sorts of things. And then the recession of the 1990s hit, and I went my own way, and I started up my company, Taggart Model Making and Design, and I started making models of historic buildings, which was quite different work from doing pop videos, and I found it far more enjoyable. Jerry and I then got back together in 2000, and we created this amazing model. It's only a slice of the Auschwitz concentration camp, which was truly vast, and it has on it 6,000 individual lead cast figures. And here I feel that this is going right back to the work of William Seiborn and his lead cast figures for the Battle of Waterloo. Placing these figures took a team of 3 of us a year, and it was a staggering project to be involved in. And I doing it used to have nightmares about it, because we used to study books of photographs of the real concentration camps and try and place figures in queues and lines, descending from these trains and being sorted into groups. And now looking at the news today and looking at what's going on in Ukraine, I feel this is sort of haunting me again. And I find it so moving to watch the news and to think of history repeating itself so tragically. So moving on in my career a little bit, after doing a set piece like the Auschwitz project, I was then very lucky to have another large model to produce. And this is a model of Nonsuch Palace, which was created for the Friends of Nonsuch Museum, which is in Cheam in South London. And they have a tiny little museum, which is all funded by volunteers, and it works brilliantly. And they have artifacts and pieces of Nonsuch Palace, which is in the grounds of the park in Cheam. But what they never had was an overall view of this palace, which was built for Henry VIII's son, Edward VI, in 1538. And it was built as his sort of nursery. It has on it something like 690 stucco plaster panels, which you can see all along the surface of the outside of the building. Each one of these panels was a little allegory, told a story. Some of them are the stories of the Greek myths or the Roman gods. Some of them are stories of antiquity and of history. And each one had been hand carved in plaster by an artisan, and the whole palace was actually erected in something like 2 or 3 years. It was built very, very fast by a huge team of workers. And what was amazing was that they built it almost like a theatre set. The whole palace was built on a timber frame, and then these great, beautiful plaster relief statues were hung on the timber frame, and the whole thing was insulated from the weather using lead. So in between the plaster panels, there are sort of lead channels and lead protection on the timber frame. What this did mean was that the palace itself was destined not to survive. And within a few years, the water had started to get at the timber frame, and the palace needed so much upkeep and so much renewal every year that it just became a financial disaster. When Henry VIII died, it passed to Elizabeth I, and she gifted it to various aristocrats. It went down the line and ended up with the Dowager Duchess of Devonshire in 1690. And the poor old Duchess was a bit of a gambler, and she lost the palace in a game of cards in Paris in 1690. And after that, her debts were called in, the palace was demolished, and now there is absolutely nothing left of it. So when the Nonsuch Museum approached me, they really wanted this model to illustrate what the palace would have looked like for visitors who'd come to see what was now a sort of lumpy, bumpy field, in a similar way to what the remains of Wallingford Castle. After Nonsuch, I moved on to some other very large projects. And over the years, I've been now doing this sort of historic model making for over 25 years. And this was one of the high points of my career, was creating 3 models for Windsor Castle. This was for their new visitor centre at the castle, at the Moat Room, where visitors would enter, and they're shown a timeline of kings and queens. And I was asked to produce this model and 2 others, which explained the evolution of the castle. The models were made in various types of plaster, wood, metal, plastics, all the materials that I use all the time. And then they were cast so that they looked like bronze sculptures. They weren't actually made out of bronze, they were actually made out of a sort of plastic and fiberglass resin. Even the Queen sadly couldn't run to having them cast in bronze, which we did get an estimate for, and it would have cost something in the region of £100,000 to cast this piece in bronze. So we decided in the end, for reasons of budget, to have them cast in fiberglass and with bronze powder in it. So they do have that wonderful luster, and when they're polished, they even shine like bronze. But they're a good deal easier to manufacture. Now, what I'd like to do at this stage of the talk is move on to Wallingford Castle. This amazing illustration by June Strong has been one of the most useful pieces of information I've had to work with for the project. And the project, as I'm sure most of you will be aware, has involved a great deal of pulling in different source material from different areas. I'm now just going to minimize my screen if I can. So just bear with me while I work out how to do that. Just excuse me a moment. Sorry to have to juggle screens, but as I said to Steve just before we started, this is actually the first presentation I've given on Zoom. So I hope that it's all making sense, and I hope that everybody can hear me all right, and that it's all working. Just to have an interlude from the slideshow projection, what I'd like to do is show you the process that went into creating the model of Wallingford Castle. When I first met with Judy and Steve and Catherine, one of the first things that they showed me was an Ordnance Survey map of the site. And this gave me a really good impression of what was going to be involved in creating the model, namely that there was so much sort of unknown territory. And I have to admit that to begin with, I was slightly daunted at the prospect of trying to recreate the castle in its full glory, given the amount of information that you see before you on the Ordnance Survey map. But I started drawing in various sources of information from other places. Steve suggested, which was an absolute stroke of genius, that I look at getting a survey from the excuse me, sorry, I'm just fumbling with my notes, from DEFRA, which was able to give me a geophysical, a LiDAR survey. Let me show you that. Now, what's very interesting when the LiDAR survey and the Ordnance Survey map are overlaid over the top of each other is you can see that there are some slight inconsistencies in terms of where the depths and heights are located. And this all set me thinking that this was going to be rather a challenge to try and tie all this together. But it is fascinating to see the LiDAR survey and the Ordnance Survey, one on top of the other. I then introduced a geophysical survey. I'm going to switch the LiDAR survey off and the Ordnance Survey off for a moment. And this again was an absolute revelation because you can really start to see the detail in the geophysical survey of all of the elements of the castle. Obviously, this is shown over time, so there are other elements as well. There are Victorian pathways, there are drainage ditches from the 19th and 20th century. There are all sorts of very strange and anomalous things. But what we were looking for mostly was where we had areas of bright light, which showed that there were large concentration of masonry. And one of the most peculiar areas for the large concentration of masonry was this strange horseshoe-shaped feature here, which I will come back to later on. So starting to overlay the various elements, we have the geophysical survey, we have the Ordnance Survey map, we have the LiDAR survey. Also, quite interestingly, if I switch those all off again, was a survey from 1804. Now, this wasn't topographically accurate, but what I found very useful was seeing the shape of the moats and also the shading here, which indicated where the moats might have been. And also showing here the college buildings and the Dean's Lodging, which at this stage in 1804 were still standing and had not reached the level of decay that they currently are in. And so it was very useful to have that information as well. So I'll just switch the 1804 map off, and gradually, as I built up the layers, I was able to start introducing contour lines. The contour lines were very, very useful. Let me just switch off the LiDAR. You can see them more clearly. Yeah, the contour lines obviously didn't quite line up with today's Ordnance Survey map, or indeed with the LiDAR survey, because I was trying to get the contours as they would have been in the 13th century, not as they are now. And so there are various areas like this ramp here, which I ignored, and various other areas. So this again, this was where I started to put in a little bit of artistic license and a little bit of sort of educated thought as to where the various land features would have been. Having got the contours organized, it was then the next step was to add the moats. And then we start getting a real picture of the terrain and the landscape in the castle. Then the really hard work started with the land features and the paths and the town buildings. Now, this is basically the layout of the entire model. We had several long Zoom meetings with the team from the museum, where we would literally discuss every single building in minute detail. And we would talk about the shape of the building and its architectural features. And we started down here with the southern gate and the bridge. And we discussed these watchtowers and whether there would have been one or two and the configuration of the moats. And we gradually made our way up from the outer bailey into the inner bailey and into the Barbican area, which is over here. We discussed that the probability of there being a prison building. And let me just switch on. I have got one more layer to switch on, which is a few labels to populate the buildings and to show the purposes of each building. So it became a very, very detailed and complex document for me to work from. And the building process of the model and the process of planning, I think, were sort of maybe sort of 40% planning and 60% model making. But for this project, the level of planning involved was truly immense. This was really the starting point for the planning, and it went on even further than this, which I'll get to in a moment. But I'm so proud to produce this as a document, and I'm hoping that it has many uses for the future. I think that not only did it supply information for the model, but I think that it could supply a lot of educational information in the future. There are so many unanswered questions. For instance, the LiDAR anomaly that we spoke about a moment ago, this shape here, which we really never quite got to the bottom of. We argue about whether it could have been a mill or a grain store or some sort of enclosure. And it was decided in the end just to call it the Great Enclosure. It definitely stood there. It was definitely made of masonry. Its true purpose may never be discovered, but I hope that my contribution to pinpointing it on this map will prove useful in the future. So now I'm just going to leave my drawing program and continue with the next part of the talk, which is again another little PowerPoint presentation for you. So after the huge amount of work on the map, the next stage of the project was to make all the buildings three-dimensional. This was a little cardboard model I made of the keep. Every single building had to be independently drawn in 3 dimensions. The keep I decided to create using inspiration from Wallingford Castle and also inspiration from Framlingham, both in Suffolk and both of the same sort of period. There were lots of architectural features that I looked at in many castles throughout the UK, which influenced me into the design that I put into Wallingford. But I think that Wallingford and Framlingham were one of the most influential. So every single building on the model had to be populated with elevation drawings. I think there were over 30 or 40 in the end, sheets like this of each individual element of the castle. This is the most complex one for the Great Tower. And it created something that I almost had as a sort of fold out section. So having produced all these drawings, I finally got started on the model itself. And this is the model in my workroom. It's 1.50 meter square. And to start at the bottom, we had to build the moats. And so these are all made of perspex and laid on a sheet of cork. And this was sort of day one of construction. The perspex had to be painted from the back so that it had the color of the moats in the color of the river on it. And it was almost like they do this with doing celluloid cartoons and painting animations, is that they paint celluloid from the back and then film it from the front. And this was a similar technique. So I had to paint all of the different colors of the river here on the reverse side of this perspex, and then screw it down. And then on top of that came layers and layers of cork to produce the terrain. I started building the terrain up in layers of 2mm cork, and I started building the walls themselves of the castle, mostly in wood, and the wood has been laser cut so that you have all the crenellations, the merlons and so on shown here. And these are all drawn by me, and then the drawings are sent away to a company that can laser cut them, and the accuracy is phenomenal. So once they were laser cut, I was able to clad them in a texture to give them a stone appearance. So here's a little tiny section of the walls. So each building had to be assembled in that way. And here's one of the gatehouses from the southern gate. And this is the Chapel of St. Nicholas. And in its fairly completed stage, having had all its cladding and also window detailing attached. This is the Hall of the Knights and the Squires, and the window detailing on this is actually made of brass. I produced the brass again by drawing on the computer and using a photo etching technique where anything that I draw in black ink can be photographically reproduced in brass using light sensitive gel, which is painted onto the sheet of brass. So you expose the gel to light, having got the artwork attached to it, and anything that is not black ink on my drawing is instantly eaten away. So you end up with being able to produce most amazingly detailed things like the fretwork on these amazing Gothic windows. And this is a technique I use a lot in my work. One of the most daunting aspects of the model was the town, because it wasn't really a hero of the project. It was a background player, a bystander, if you like, but it had to be there. And unlike doing an illustration of a historical scene, if there's a sort of background which can be faded away, if it's a painting or a drawing, you can just sort of add a few clouds, or you can just, make it a bit vague, or put a few trees in the background. And it's, you can get away with not including anything. When you build a scale model, there's nowhere to hide. If you've got a cluster of buildings and that they're there, but you don't actually build them, then they're absent. And someone's going to say, well, where are those buildings? So there was a slavish attention to detail, and hundreds of buildings had to be produced, which constitute the medieval town. Each building, in order to make them individual, had this timber bracing, which again I made using a brass acid etching technique, so that I made sure that each building was unique. And here I have piles of these timber frames which were adhered to the outside of the building. And then the buildings were painted with different roof colors, again to give them variety, different colors in the lime mortar of the walls to give them more variety. And these are old film canisters, which are absolutely ideal for storing paint in. But you can see they do give you a sense of scale, the minuteness of the whole project. So after all the buildings were set in to the cork landscape, they were painted in washes of greys and ochres and colours of stone. And then the next major stage was adding the plaster, which was the landscape. And you can see here that the plaster section has just been added. What I decided to do was make a mixture of plaster of Paris, which had a resin in it to make it very hard wearing and very tough. And also I added pigments to that so that you had a sort of ground which was earth colored. The next job was to paint this earth colored ground. Wherever there were lawns, I painted it green. Where there were paths, I left it blank so that the earth color shone through. And sometimes I actually sanded the surface of the plaster, which sort of burnished it and produced this wonderful textured technique, which worked really, really well. And the final stage of producing the landscaping was to add a sort of flock. This is a very fine dust of green filaments, which are glued to the surface, and they give the appearance of grass, which I find is very useful, and also has a brilliant way of contrasting with the painted texture of the buildings, so that you have a very different textured surface to the surface of the buildings. What I really enjoyed doing on this project especially was adding all the weathering and all of the distressing to try and make the castle look aged. So it was great fun to add all these washes of color underneath these elements here and on the rooftops and so on. So this is the model completed. I'm not sure how we're doing for time, but I'd like to go on a little further, if I'm not boring you all, because this wasn't the end of the story. Once I had completed the model, I then had to build the display cabinet, which it's housed in. And right from the start, the team at the museum and I discussed how this was going to work. And it was a challenge. What I wanted to do is produce something that revealed the model as you come into the room. So you don't see it from the entrance room. It's a discovery that you suddenly happen upon. And I decided the way to do this was to produce a model with an upstand. And the upstand not only produces a sense of revealing it, but also gives a brilliant opportunity to have some display space, both front and back. And one of the things that I felt was really important about this model was to try and put in the sense of informing the visitor about what they're seeing. So not only do you have the model to look at, but you also have this information panel above the model. And we jointly wrote a short history here, and then I listed all the buildings that we've got on the right-hand side and numbered them, so that we have a schematic diagram, which I hope will inform the visitor so they don't get completely lost when looking at the model itself. And so this was in my workroom, final stages of creating the model. And I must say, out of all of the moments of putting this together, the most nerve-wracking thing for me was putting this lettering onto the backboard of the display. The letters are ultra sticky, and you only have one chance at sticking them down. Once they're stuck, they're stuck. And so it was a moment with many sweaty palms, just trying to ease this letter by letter onto the surface without making a complete hash of it. But it was managed in the end. And so here is the day of the installation. And I hope with very happy customers. But thank you for listening to the talk. I would just like to show you one last thing, if I can end that, which is just to show you this little movie I took on my phone. And I just think this is rather lovely, as it flies you around the model. You can see Wallingford Castle reimagined in all its glory. So thank you very much. I welcome any questions. Steve, if you'd like to take the floor.
Okay then, Ben. Well, thanks very much indeed. That was wonderful, sort of reliving some of the aspects, and your model has been so much admired. I mean, one of the things that struck me when you were talking about the plans and the discussions, I remember sitting in listening to Catherine and Judy and yourself debating where various bits went for 5 hours, and you know, it was 5 hours.
It was absolutely.
But I actually, it was so enthralling to see the whole model and the castle unveiling, because you had to put your you said you had to put the models in the town because you couldn't leave nothing.
Yes.
But what it really thought was when all of the research that Catherine and Judy had done in particular it's all very well having vague ideas, but when you're modeling it, you've got to convert a vague idea into an absolute one, and that really focused the mind. And it was really quite incredible seeing how it actually had to take place.
Oh, well, thank you. I think it's always this sort of tyranny of making something in its absolute form, that there's no sort of fuzzing the edges.